Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to speak for a few minutes on the Serve America Act. I think this is a great opportunity to talk about what's good about a lot of the members of the Senate. And I certainly appreciate and applaud the sponsors of this bill for their good intentions. And I know their hearts are in the right place, and some of my best friends are supporting this bill. But I think as we look at what's good about the hearts of many members of the Senate, we need to recognize that this bill does represent a lot of what's wrong with our federal government today, a lot of our philosophies, a lot of our departures from a constitutional form of government. What works in America today is our civil society, a lot of the volunteer groups that many of us have been a part of. I know for years I've spent more time in United Way and a lot of the charity groups being on board, on their boards back in my community, and I saw what the volunteer arts groups and PTAs and health groups, what they did to build a strong community. Civil society works in America. They are small groups. They're the true engines of character in our country. They promote service and patriotism. And in this time where we've seen some of our economic institutions let us down, we've certainly seen our government and our policies let us down, civil society does not let us down. It works in America today. And it's understandable why Congress would want to get involved, is see that passion to serve, that desire to do something that's greater than yourselves, for us to look at that working in our civil society and want to get involved and expand it. But unfortunately, our history shows us when government gets involved that it tends to take something that's working and make it not work nearly as well. Civil society works because it's everything that government is not. It's small, it's personal, it's responsive, it's accountable. Civil society must be protected from any effort to make it more like government. And that's what we're doing with this bill today. This bill centralizes control of important functions of our civil society. There's a downside to good intentions here in government. The founders created a limited government, and our oath to support and defend the Constitution means that that is our focus here, that our oath is to a limited government. The founders wanted the people to be free from our good intentions. Government charity is anathema to what our founders intended and what our Constitution stands for. Despite our good intentions, when we try to implement those good intentions and our compassion through the force of government, we are effectively violating our oath of office here. Well-intended legislation has left more than half of all Americans dependent on the government. Today in America, over half of Americans get their income from the government or a government source. About 20% of the country works for the government or an entity that gets its primary source of revenue from government. Another 20% get their income and health care from Medicare, Social Security. And once you add in welfare and other subsidies, you put it over half of Americans are already dependent on the government. This bill proposes to spend nearly $6 billion over 5 years, which means it's going to be over $10 billion, probably a lot more over a 10-year period. It's going to have near 250,000 Americans working for it, which means it will be the 14th largest company as far as employees in the entire world. What have we done here that suggests we can manage anything like that? Do you see anything in our history as a federal government that shows that we have the ability to effectively manage something like that without extreme levels of waste and fraud and abuse? Look what we've done recently with the stimulus plan and the bailout plans. As soon as it comes to light what's actually happening with that money, people are outraged at what's going on. Despite the good intentions of this bill, we are creating a huge new government entity that will be unmanageable and violates some of the core principles of our civil society. Every time the government steps in to solve a problem, it creates 3 new problems in its place. This bill is everything wrong with how Congress sees the world. Government will make service organizations less effective, less responsive, and less personal. When the French historian de Tocqueville came to the United States not long after we were founded, one of the things that amazed him about our country that was so different from France, in his home country, when there was a problem, people would say someone ought to do it and the government should do it. But in America, we were different. When someone saw a problem, they went and got a friend and formed a small group and solved the problem themselves. And much of that was motivated by religious convictions that our place in this world is not only to help ourselves, but to love and help those around us. That was key. You know, Jefferson called it little democracies when he saw these little groups all around America voluntarily doing things to solve problems and to make communities better. Burke called them little platoons. And most people who understand America knows that those voluntary groups are what made our country great. Civil society binds communities, not by its fruits, but by its motives. Charity, donations, giving without thought of getting anything in return. This is a selfless sacrifice that happens throughout America today. This is what works. What doesn't work is what we're doing right here. The big difference: private service organizations exist for the people who receive the aid. Government service organizations exist for the people who give it. And in this case, for the people who are paid to do it. You can't pay people to volunteer and expect the organization to remain focused on its mission. Charity is a private, moral impulse, not a government program. Government will not, and by definition cannot, strengthen and replace the civil society. Volunteerism is something that works in America. When we think of America, we don't think of Congress and presidents. We think of the Little League games and PTA meetings and bake sales. Civil society is America. It responds to needs, meets challenges, and solves problems because it's free from government. Because volunteers donate their time and money, accountability is acute. I've seen it. I've sat on a United Way board, and every year we evaluate every program and every dollar we've given to someone, and we determine, is it working or can we make it more efficient? And if the program's not working, the money goes away immediately. That doesn't happen here. If the program doesn't work here, we add more money to it. And that's going to happen with every program we start, including the one we're talking about here today. Projects that don't work in a civil society get cut. Organizers who lose or abuse funds are dismissed. It's voluntary. So everyone is invested in its success. We know the large groups throughout America, the Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts, the United Way, Salvation Army, the YMCA, Catholic Charities, fraternal orders, groups like Kiwanis and Rotary, and Knights of Columbus. These are large organizations, but they work because they're locally controlled. Smaller groups, local arts councils and community theaters, PTAs, youth sports leagues, the animal rescues, the book clubs, crisis pregnancy centers, soup kitchens, food and other clothes drives that go on, church service groups. They're everywhere. And those are the little platoons, the little democracies that make this country work. For us to presume here in the United States Congress that somehow we're going to reach out into all these groups and make it work better is pretty presumptuous based on our history. Why now? Why at a time in economic crisis with unimaginable debt and spending do we come in and say we need to spend another $10 billion over the next 10 years to create another government program to do something that's already working. And at the same time we're talking about creating this new bureaucracy to replace private volunteerism with government programming, we're actually cutting some of the incentives for people to give to charity and for the private sector to work. The President's budget actually cuts the charitable donations of the people who give the most to charity in this country. So look at what we're doing. We're making it harder for the private sector to work. And you also look at what we've done over the years, forgetting that a lot of private charity and a motivation to serve God and community is a religious-based motivation. What have we done in this country? We've essentially tried to purge that motivation from our country. You know, most public schools, or at least a lot of them, used to sponsor Boy Scout groups. But after being sued for years, because the Boy Scouts have God in their pledge, and they set standards for their leaders that some don't agree with, that the threat of lawsuits have essentially mean our government schools have thrown out the Boy Scouts. The Boy Scouts, more than half of our astronauts, half of our FBI agents, a lot of the most successful people in this country were trained in the Boy Scouts to serve their community, where their character was developed. But this federal government has forced them out of public places. And for years we've purged religion from our society. Religion was the primary motivation for a lot of civic groups, a lot of service, a lot of charity, a lot of hospitals that were formed, a lot of schools. But we've said that that has no place. And because we've unleashed the ACLU and other groups to constantly sue and intimidate groups, that religious motivation has been moved, has been purged in many cases. And now we're going to come in and help solve the problem we've created. Is we want to promote volunteerism. We want to promote community service, when what we've done over the last several decades is essentially to try to destroy the motivation for people to serve a cause that's greater than themselves. We can't replace private charity with government programs. And if we try, a lot of people are going to miss meals, suffer cold winters, and leaky roofs. I want to go back to where I started. I appreciate the motivation, the heartfelt sense of compassion, and the patriotism that I know my colleagues feel in sponsoring this legislation. But I think we need to come to a point as a government here that we recognize that we can't do everything. That's why we take the oath to the Constitution, to defend and protect a very limited form of government. This Congress, this government does not need to start or expand an organization to 250,000 people where we're paying people to do work that we decide needs to be done, and take those decisions out of the hands of millions of Americans who look around every day and see what they can do to make their families, their communities, and their country a better place to live. These are not government decisions. We need to focus on what we were set up to do and do it much better than we're doing, instead of every week coming in here, bringing our good intentions and our compassion. In every problem we see across the country, we say something needs to be done. And then we say the government needs to do it. And that's the fatal flaw of Congress today, is we forget that sacred oath of office that says we'll protect and defend the Constitution, which says this federal government has a very limited function. And those functions that aren't prescribed in the Constitution are left to individuals and to the states. This is a huge, well-intended mistake that we're making. And there's a point that we need to realize that this government needs to stop spending, stop borrowing, stop taxing, and let America work.